All right, count them down. I don't know who's counting them down more, me or you. But boy, I just promise you, man, I'm putting some X's on some calendars.
It's just the class.
What's that?
This class.
I teach 3 other classes.
For us.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this one on Wednesday. All right, well, let's go ahead and do what we're gonna do today. So I think I left off somewhere in this area, talking about how I was spraying roadsides with this hydro seeder. We talked about some of the different ways that we can control runoff and stuff, and if you move on to soil and water conservation, we'll kind of address those more in depth. If you go work for the NRCS, these are kind of some of the things that they do. Army Corps of Engineers. I think we talked about the Dust Bowl. So back in the 30s, we didn't really have much agriculture going on, and after we had kind of used up all the agriculture lands in the east, everyone started traveling west, and when they did, there was nothing grown out there because it's hot and there's no rainfall, so no plants can grow, and they had this big problem with this dust being lifted into the air. So I think we talked about the same mechanics as water erosion, but our movements were different. And so we'll have this saltation, which is kind of this bouncing effect of the soil, and if you get enough bounces going, eventually that soil particle will break up into smaller fragments. Once it breaks up into those smaller fragments, it's probably more likely to creep along the surface or be lifted up and suspended in the air. And so that is what happened here. That is the suspension. We made it this far, correct? All right, I think we started going into the factors that are affecting wind erosion. Kind of the same things that we would expect for water, just kind of, we talk about turbulence being the wind movement, but runoff would be the water movement, right? So that's going to be affected by slope. Our surface roughness is going to influence that, and as with both soil properties and vegetation, are going to minimize any type of erosion. So we looked at the USL, the universal soil loss equation, just because people want to be like, they feel like they have their own little special thing. The people who studied wind erosion came up with their own equation. We won't necessarily go over that, but if you look here, you can see some of the factors are kind of the same. We've got a climate, which is kind of like what comparing the wind erosion and the soil loss equation. Climate is like the R, and I is really like the K. And then they have some other things that kind of play into that. I doubt that you'll ever use this, but just know that there is a formula, and y'all did really well on the USL, so it's really just plug and play, right? It's figure out what the value is for each one of those variables and multiply. A couple other things that are going to influence this. One is going to be soil moisture. And why would soil moisture have an influence on wind erosion? Minimizing it. If you have a wet soil, would you expect there to be more or less wind erosion? Because the water holds it together. There's a couple of other things. It might be like 1 or 2 more other things as to why we would have less wind erosion if we had a moist soil. It's heavier, correct. So it's really hard to pick that soil particle up. It might creep, but it still wouldn't because it's held together by the aggregate stability. It's not lifted up in the air. Tillage, the more we till, we break that aggregate stability. We're also drying our soil out quicker because now it's exposed to the atmosphere. But we can put up these barriers that are going to kind of break the wind, or like a windbreak. And so you might see this around. I always kind of wonder why there was like a tree line in a field. Why not just cut the whole thing down? Like, why not just make it all one field, right? But using these trees as windbreaks. If you have a tree, that you can protect an area 10 times the height of the tree. So if you have a 50-foot tree, how much area on the other side of that tree is going to be protected from wind erosion? 500 feet. And so we have these grass windbreaks that probably about half as much of that. And so typically, you know, our grass windbreaks are going to be a bush of some sort, about hip, maybe chest high. Maybe you can get something a little bit taller, but probably not. Like, they're typically going to be our bushes. So that's kind of why we have those around. They help minimize the impact of wind on our plants or our house in this picture. And then finally, just to look at some of the other things, the actual application of that. We have windbreaks around the field. We have some grass around our vegetables that are stopping those little particles from actually, like, anyone ever worked with a sandblaster in an auto shop? No? Well, anyone ever been on the beach and it'd be really windy and that sand hits you? Think about our plants being very tender and very soft, and when that sand strikes that soft tissue leaf surface, it cuts it. And when it cuts it, the plant can't do photosynthesis as well. So it's going to suffer from that. So it's kind of a protection to make sure that our, first off, that our plants, like the actual plant itself, like a tomato plant, we want to make sure that that's got exactly what it needs in order to do its thing, photosynthesis. But once the fruit sets, that sand hits that fruit and cuts it, and then now the quality of our produce has degraded. And the more it degrades, the less we can get for it. So being able to protect that is going to help us maximize our profitability. Any questions on erosion? All right, so I teach this soil and water conservation class. I was thrown on me this semester, and what I realized after teaching soils last semester is that this is bridging the gap between soils. Like, we left off last semester with erosion and things like this, and then when I got to soil and water conservation, it picked up with soil health and soil quality. So we're just going to kind of, these are going to be the things that you might hear in the future. Companies like Indigo Ag, and there was another one that starts with a D, Dendron or something. I don't know. I'll have to look that up. But these companies and the research that we're thinking about moving forward is to improve our soil health. And therefore, by improving soil health, we improve our crop quality, or the soil quality as well. And so these terms are typically used kind of interchangeably, but as I started reading this and doing this coursework, and it's really kind of like, you can really relate it to human health as well. Like, what are some of the things that doctors might measure to describe whether or not you're healthy? Blood pressure, oxygen levels, temperature, resting heart rate. Anybody know about resting heart rate? Mine is super high. I thought it was just what it was when I was sitting down. That's not true. It's how long it takes for the blood to actually circulate through your body. How many beats does it take for your heart to get the blood circulated, one circulation through your body? Mine was like 97. My grandfather was like, "Oh my God." Like, what? I thought, is that not good? He's like, "No, mine's 70. Oh. Uh-oh. So the soil health is important for this nutrient cycling. How the water moves within it, much like us, like we need to be able to drink water so that we can stay healthy during the summer months, which is coming up. So start drinking water now. I don't know if y'all know this, but if you're working outside, the water you drank yesterday is the water that you're using today. And then the water that you drink today will be the water that you use tomorrow. So, just something to think about. Like, make sure you're drinking enough water so that you can stay healthy during the summer and you can continue to do your job. As we just mentioned, we don't necessarily measure this directly. This isn't like a temperature thing where you go, boop, healthy, right? It's the combined components of this soil to make sure that everything is functioning properly. Did I have anything written down for this slide? No? So some of those factors that we measure, they are typically easy to measure, just like temperature or blood pressure, a little cuff. We can measure the changes in the soil functions, and then we can also kind of see how the climate and our management practices impact soil health. So one of the projects that I'll be working on over the summer is just kind of understanding grazing patterns on tall fescue and how that affects soil health. And is that respiration? Is it carbon sequestration? Does the infiltration change as we graze these crops? And so there will be several parameters underneath these: physical, chemical, and biological. And so physical, we're thinking like structure, infiltration, texture, organic matter, might be kind of chemical and biological. Chemical is going to be things like pH, our organic matter content, nutrient content, N, P, K, sulfur. Are these being wasted? Are we holding on to them the right way? Are they plants available? Is the plant taking them up? What is the soil's role in that? CEC, things of that nature. Our aggregate stability is going to be important, structure, water capacity, and then infiltration. Just some of the things that we would be measuring for our chemical properties. And if you look, some of these things are on that soil test report. And you can do some other things on the soil test report too. You can have the lab do that for you to find out if your soil is operating healthily. Most of the time you can see it because there's no plants growing on. That's going to be the first indicator that your soil is not healthy. Something is wrong. What is wrong and how do we go about fixing it? And then some of our biological properties. If you don't have earthworms kind of hanging out in your soil, you might have some issues because they can't dig in it, right? If they can't dig in it, it's compacted. If it's compacted, there's no air in it, the plants aren't growing. That's why the plants aren't growing, because there's no earthworms, right? So all those things kind of play in together. This is just kind of some information about some of the things that we look at and the relationships that we'll be making. So if you move on to fertility, that's going to be based on structure and erosion, being able to hold on to that soil. Some of our physical properties that are mostly associated with either water infiltration or root growth. And then we have the stuff that we send off to the lab that we necessarily don't go out and measure ourselves. We'll take a soil sample and send all that stuff over to the water center and let them do it for us. So it's kind of important to know which one of these things that you can influence and which ones you can't. Kind of like on assignment 2 when I asked you, which of these factors are static? Or which one of these, I guess when we're talking about soil properties, which ones are inherent? The ones you can't change. So things like texture. We can't necessarily change the texture, that's a climate and a weathering thing. We can't change how deep the soils are. We don't have any influence on how deep our soil is. The weathering process does. And then some of the other things like rock fragments and drainage. If we never touch the soil, it has its own drainage characteristics, infiltration, things of that nature. So inherent properties are the things we cannot change. And if you think about it like humans, I cannot change my eye color. I can put contacts in, but I didn't change my eye color. But the dynamic ones are the ones that can be changed. And so when I think of dynamic, I think of changing. So static is stationary or fixed, and dynamic is going to be changing. We can change the available water capacity by plowing or tilling. We can change infiltration by tilling. Organic carbon, either tilling or no-tilling. So if we no-till, we're going to increase soil organic carbon. If we till, we're likely to decrease it. So these are the human acts. These are the actions that humans take that influence the health of our soil. You might hear this term soil productivity, and if you look in Web Soil Survey, they'll give you land capability classifications, land productivity classifications. No one can just agree on one thing. So you kind of have to know what you're talking about, or at least looking for, when we're looking at soil productivity or land classifications. Some lands you just cannot use for agriculture. It's just not good for the soil, and it won't be good for you, because if the soil's not good, your agriculture is not good. Nothing on this. So being able to understand what type of productivity you have, and you can get this from Web Soil Survey. Like most of this information is going to be contained in Web Soil Survey. That's why we've been using that. You can find out the land capability. You can find out what vegetables and grains might be good for your land. Is it even good to grow anything on it? In those tabs on the left side, you can search through each one of those and find out whether or not that's good hay ground. The biggest difference between soil quality and soil health is that soil health recognizes this as a function, as a vital living system. That's where you hear this thing that says soils are alive. That as a unit, as a system, we need that soil to function, much like our bodies. Our bodies are a system, it's not just a one thing. So instead of just as a growing medium, they see it as this living, dynamic, and ever so subtly changing environment. Like soils are not static. They just take a very long time to become visually dynamic. But there are these equilibriums, and there are these changes, and it's never the same from day to day. So if you ever run across anything and someone wonders why the soil looks good over here and not over there, it meant it's just soil variability. I was doing research with my major professor, my master's, and I was like, I don't understand what's going on. And he let me run around in a circle for like 3 months, and then he finally just went, soil variability, what are you going to do about it? Like, what do you mean soil? What am I going to do about it? Are you serious? You mean to tell me you had me doing this work for a year and a half, and I spent 3 months trying to figure this thing out, and the answer is, it's just not the same? But that's it, is that it's just not the same. There's a reason why that hayfield makes more, Michael. There is